Well, I'll launch and do a quick thing, right?
Okay.
Right. All right, welcome everyone online and here in the room. So welcome to the TUSM Global Health Seminar Series. So we're really excited today for our speaker. Before that, I just want to make a plug for the subsequent talks in the series for the rest of the semester. So in February, we'll have Ochia Wunma Akuyu Ibe talking about community healthcare workers in global projects, particularly in African countries. March 13th, we'll have Cherry Kang from who's now currently at the Gates Foundation and head of global health there, as well as she has a long history of working on vaccines and enteric disease in India, so she'll be speaking and coming in from Seattle. On April 17th, we'll have Indra Narayanan talking about neonatal survival and strategies to improve neonatal survival. So please stay tuned. Those will all be circulated. Hopefully, if you receive this notice, you'll receive those. And I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker, who will be talking about a people's health movement, Sawubona and the rise of healing circles. So Dr. Evan Agasa is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UMass Boston. He is also a clinical psychologist by training. So I think brings a lot of expertise to the room today. So he works on examining how the US's history of anti-Blackness has shaped psychological realities in and outside of our borders. He's director of the ASILI Collective, a research group whose work focuses on broadly addressing the mental health and consequences of structural anti-Blackness through the lens of Black liberation psychology. So we're really excited to hear about his research today and about this topic. So thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. Oh man, I'm really excited to be here to share some of this work with you all. And I love these little pointers. Unfortunately, this one is like so, you can't even see that, right? You can't even see the little razor. So you have to bear with me. I usually get so excited pointing at all these things. But the Healing Circle work is work that I started when I was finishing my degree at Fordham University right in 2020. And watching it grow, take off, become what it is today has been truly one of the best things of my career. So we're going to get into some of the history, but we're going to start with some theoretical, some philosophical foundations, because some of the work that is built on tends not to be traditionally taught within medical school, within psychology programs. So we're going to be moving through quite a bit of that. So I first want to note that the work has been supported by SAMHSA, as well as the New York Office of Mental Health. The Sawubona Healing Circles themselves are a program that we built for the Association of Black Psychologists. So all of this work is built with their support. Okay, check it here, perfect. And so I'm going to start by asking, do y'all know how many countries there are in Africa? You might know that question. We're going to be doing some trivia. Everybody got that?
52.
Oh, so close.
53.
So closer. Oh my gosh. One more.
54.
Bam, that's it. Fantastic. Okay. And do y'all know how many languages there are? Ballpark.
More than that.
More than that. This guy knows what he's doing. So that's the right answer.
In the thousands?
In the thousands, right? So I'll get right to it, right? As many as 2,000 languages, over 3,000 ethnic groups. So when we talk about a Healing Circle project, a healing project that's built on Africanness, that's built on African culture, what does it mean for us to write together, right? These distinct, right? 3,000 distinct ethnic groups, distinct histories, distinct interrelationships. Right? There are multiple schools of thought. I'm gonna give you all I have the name right there. So I'm gonna do a little extra quiz. But we have this man right here, Frantz Fanon. Right? I really recommend, if you haven't, check out those books, Black Skin, White Mask, Wretched of the Earth, essential reading. And so for Frantz Fanon, his idea was African culture, Black culture was constructed, right? It was in some ways, and I don't want to say artificial, but a response, right, to the colonialism, the anti-Black racism, the African and African diasporic peoples were experiencing. So thus, there's no authentic, natural African culture that arises by observing these distinct communities. What we call African culture is a response, right, to that oppression. Right? It's constructing and seeking to humanize the peoples who've been, right, harmed by a type of genocidal oppression. The other school of thought, though, and one that's, right, really threaded a lot of what's become, right, African-centered psychology, and we'll get into that, comes from Chikantadeo. And so Chikantadeo said, when you look at these distinct African cultures, while there's nuances, while there are these distinct histories, nonetheless, because of the migrations, the patterns, we see these threads that manage to connect, like a web, each of these distinct cultures. This metaculture, we might call it, is what we then will classify as an African culture. And so this proposed cultural thread, right, traces back to what a lot of African-centered psychologists will talk about as this migration, this cultural migration from, right, ancient Egypt, Kemet, as well as Nubia Kush, right, some of the most ancient of civilizations, right, through, yeah, this pointer is not it at all. You see this little thing, right? Through the Proto-Bantu, the Bantu-Congo migrations, right, that took these cultural influences from Western to Eastern and much of Southern Africa. Is why you have a lot of what people call like Bantu peoples, right? So you can see people within Kenya who have cultural philosophy that they share with the Zulu people that they can trace, right, through this migration. So when people talk about an African culture, it's not meant to override those distinct histories, not meant to override the identities of those specific peoples, right? It's meant to identify and understand what philosophies, right, can we pull from this. Right? What does our understanding of psychology, our understanding of humanity, our understanding of being look like when we incorporate the lessons, the philosophies, the histories of some of the earliest, right, people, some of the earliest inquiries into these very questions? I'm pulling here from Haiti's first psychiatrist, Louis Mars. He says, by deepening our understanding of the relationship between culture and personality in a Haitian setting, we understand the flimsiness of the French categories that we were using so uncritically, mechanically imposing Western constructs on Haitian reality. So the project of Louis Mars, as well as his father, Jean Price Mars, was saying, we have these cultural webs, we have these cultural understandings for how we understand community, people, religion, spirit to interact. This can inform how we understand health, how we understand mental health. And trying to overimpose, right, try to fit these distinct ways of being into a Western psychological approach is rendering our understandings more shallow. It's not allowing us to do our jobs better. We're missing more than we're able to address. And so Cheryl Grills, she's one of the pioneers in the African-centered psychology movement. She's actually one of the leaders of the California, we got the camera, this is my camera right here. How you doing?
Say hi.
She's one of the leaders of the California Reparations Task Force. She says, like patches in a quilt, Africa and its diasporan kinfolk are a diversity of national and regional cultures stitched together by a common history, a shared, unifying, single fabric backing a cultural underpinning that unites the disparate patches. So what are those, what is that metaculture then? What are the specific descriptors we might look at? So Wade Noble's 1986, using some work from Tata Fukiao, identified these as these main threads. So he said, spirit being a foundational animating principle that includes the ancestors and spiritual forces. So again, when we're talking about the culture, when we're talking about mental health, understanding for a sizable number of people, right, spirit, and not just the physical, not just the mental, but the spiritual factors into how people understand themselves in the world. Nature, which provides the rules for living. I had an African-centered psychologist supervisor who says often when we're doing our intakes, we ask about your personal relationships, like your friendships, your social support, your family relationships, your parents. we don't ask people about how they relate to like water. You can tell a lot about somebody by, can you swim? What do you feel like when you get around the water? You know a lot about somebody's history, right? The environment they've been raised in, socioeconomic status by the relationship to nature. The metaphysical, right? The interconnectedness of all things and a rhythm to life, communal order and self-knowledge, essential features of what it means to be human and well, and a teleological orientation to existence, understanding things to be driven by purpose. These are core features that we might use to describe this African metaculture. And the important thing here is I see this often in multicultural classes and whatnot. When you talk about how to describe a particular culture, that is used to almost like overimpose and describe the reality of the individual. Right? This is the larger superstructure we might be understanding people to move through and be in relation to. That doesn't necessarily mean, right, that this overrides their personal experience. Right? This helps us to understand the larger world that people are operating in. So that's the history of African-centeredness. There's another piece, though, that I want to thread, and that is what what's been talked about through the study, the field of Black studies. Right? It's how we use Blackness as a framework, right? As opposed to purely a racial category marker. So we talked about those distinct school of thoughts, right? The Sheikh Anta Diop, right? That tied together the African cultural thread. The other school of thought, right, as articulated by Fanon and others, is there's this cultural thread, there's this philosophical response to oppression that we might understand in the idea of Blackness. So pulling from Marimba Ani, right, we understand the Mayafa, or the Great Disaster, represented centuries of violent assault on the cultural, social, and spiritual coherence of African peoples. Through Cedric Robinson and Frank Wilderson, we see European imperialism weaponized conceptions of racialization to justify a project of racial capitalism that saw African peoples rendered into the category of non-human. So Europeans constructed that worldview, or asili, right? Marimba Ani understood the asili to be the cultural gene that people possess, right? The overarching organizing principles that were key to a people's philosophy, in direct opposition to African and other indigenous ways of being. So all this is saying, right, is we're not only talking about the metaculture that naturally existed, we're talking about peoples who have a unique vantage point by being situated at the place of non-human in society, right? The oppression that comes with that, the dismissal, the abuse, the violence that comes with that. So when we're looking at this project, we're talking about this interweaving both of this metaculture in response to a project of global repression. And so Wahalia says, Blackness that represents a genre of social forces. I use this in a lot of my papers because I think it's so key. Often when we talk about racism, racial trauma, we're talking about just the stress that's associated with experiencing discrimination. What Wahalia asked us to do is consider what are the unique assumptions, the unique social forces, not just at the interpersonal level, but at the state level, right, that are used to discriminate against people. That tells us more about not just the psychology of the people doing the oppression. It talks to us about what's necessary to resist. And so there's a lot of information that we can gather from understanding the particularities of oppression. And so in that context, right, Blackness has been both this tool of oppression and this tool of humanizing, right, self-actualization. People have used Blackness to communicate their solidarity with people across borders. You have, there's a great story that Lorgia Garcia Pena, have that flip there, tells about in her book, where there was an Afro-German who was being discriminated against by the police. And a photo that was taken, she used the Black Power sign. She raised the fist. They don't have that history in Germany. But in that act of resistance, she's connecting to a global understanding of Blackness that allows people to understand what her experiences is. And so this last piece is just key for us to understand what this project is then, right? We're talking about an African metaculture, right, that has been co-formed with its resistance to anti-Blackness. So that's threading a lot, but I think it helps us understand the nuances of what this Healing Circle project is, because it rests on those very intersections. So what then is the African-centered and Black psychology? So African-centered and Black psychology asks the question, what does our understanding of mental health, of the mind, look like when we reroot this discipline in those indigenous wisdoms? If we don't base it in Greek Enlightenment, if we don't base it in the lab work of Wundt and William James out here, right, we take the very first people who are asking about the questions of what is the mind, right? What does it mean to be well? What does it mean to be in community? And continue that process. What assumptions shift as we think about this project of psychology? So it emerged initially in response to anti-Black oppression in the 1970s. We just had Martin Luther King Day. The formal organization, the Association of Black Psychologists, was actually founded after, it was the year following Martin Luther King Jr.'s address to the American Psychological Association. Within that address, he had asked people to uptake this role as psychologists, as social scientists, to join and advance the civil rights movement. He said people were overriding the people who were rioting. He said people weren't taking seriously the psychological reactions people were having to oppressionism, and instead using that to condemn them. And psychology has a long history of that. We can do a whole other presentation on that. And so he implored the APA to use its brilliance to uplift the humanity of Black peoples. And a year went past, the APA actually published a lot of middling kind of reviews of the speech. And in the following year, you had the formation of the Association of Black Psychologists, because they understood that you are not taking on this project, we will take on this project. And so within the Association of Black Psychologists, in that history, you have several distinct schools of thought. You have the traditional, which I would say more people are taught when you take your psychiatry classes. Like you learn about, you'll know Kenneth and Mamie Clark. You've heard of those people before. You've heard of the Dahl study. You heard of that before? Some people? My friend, you haven't heard of the Dahl? What's going on?
Dahl?
The Dahl study, we haven't heard of that? You all good, don't worry about it. We heard about it. Yeah, we got that, okay. Y'all good, don't worry. I have to get at your intro teacher. I have to get at that person. Yeah. Right. It's this idea of African Americans doing the project of psychology, right? So not necessarily critiquing the very foundations of it, but seeking to essentially diversify. You get the reformist, right? The reformist people saying psychology is racist. Here's how we could do this project, specifically of psychology, better. So you get people like Joseph White and William Cross. You might have learned them in some of your classes. William Cross did some of the first research on Black identity. Joseph White coined the term Black psychology. But their job there is, how can we make this project of psychology better? Not just by our presence, by expanding the work, expanding the theories. And last, and this is what the Healing Circle work is based in, is we get the radical school of thought. The radical school of thought is what I've threaded here today. It's this whole project is resting on this faulty assumptions, faulty cultural assumptions. What does this healing work look like? What do our commitments look like, if we be rooted in civilization? So within that, I want to bring us a little bit to contemporary times. What does our broad mental health infrastructure look like in the United States context? We know Black people make up about 4 to 5% of the mental health workforce. We know that 28% of that 4 to 5%, mental health considered leaving due to burnout, increased workload, and experienced racism. And 62% received no training in how to specifically diagnose and work with Black people. So this is the broad context in our mental health infrastructure today as it pertains to serving the Black populations that we have. That's one of the reasons I get particularly frustrated when people will say, I understand where it's coming from, but we have to do something about cultural stigma, right? Why do Black people have so much stigma when it comes to mental health? And you look at the numbers, it's we don't even have the infrastructure to meet that need. What does it mean to condemn people for not engaging in a particular type of service that you do not have the capacity to give? Right? Now, before we even get into the history, misdiagnosis, the lack of training. So
I'm going to couple this with a quote from Thomas Insel. He was the former director of the NIMH, and I think this might have been about 5 years ago. He said, I spent 13 years at the NIMH, really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded in getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at a fairly large cost, I think 20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. So again, this is our mental health infrastructure as it stands. We have often bottleneck training programs. We're going through our recruitment right now. We have like 545 applications. We're going to take maybe 8, right, to try to meet the need of this entire population that is currently being underserved. We know a lot of the therapies that we have, people have often harmful, not just racist, but like harmful interactions with service providers. It's before we even get into often the carceral nature of our mental health services. Right? Y'all know the where most people encounter mental health services for the first time. You know where that is? You said school. It's a great answer. It's the wrong answer, but it's a great answer. I like it. Oh, one more. I do this with my class all the time. I'm annoyed. Department. You said emergency department. That's a great second guess. The answer is jail and prison. Yeah, you knew. You should have said it. If you know it, you should have said it. Like, right? It's jail and prison, right? Where people encounter mental health professionals for the first time. So we're talking about a mental health system that's used far more. There's far more investment in the control and erasing of people than seeking to uplift well-being. So that's the context in which we see this rise of the healing circle modality. So African-centered healing circles are meant to be trustworthy spaces in which Black people come together to share their stories, process and heal from the historical and contemporary impact of anti-Blackness in our lives. Historically, when you trace I'm gonna do like a little timeline right after this, but you see healing circles rise in concert with these massive anti-Black racial traumas in the context of the United States. So Hurricane Katrina, we had a number that emerged following the Haitian earthquake, following police killings, shootings, right? A lot of the times you see healing circle movements rise, they really elevate in response to these things. So in these circles, right, as opposed to relying solely on the mental health professional, because we've seen, right, we do not have the infrastructure. Black people serve as each other's medicine, not only in response to collective grief and trauma that senseless killings have caused, but also for the steady, ongoing, unrelenting drumbeat of chronic, smoldering, everyday racism that Black people continue to experience. So the African-centered healing circle has come to represent a growing movement with the potential to indelibly change the way communities care for one another. Because again, we're removing, right, the professionalization, the mental health professionalization from this, because a lot of research shows when you think about what makes mental health the most effective, we have so many like deep studies. Like, is it how you move your eyes? Is it if I talk about like the story of a trauma and then introduce this like exposure? Like it's warmth, right? It's warmth, it's acceptance, right? Trust in the person you're talking to. These are the key factors that tend to make mental health treatment the most effective. So I have a brief timeline right here, specifically for the African-centered healing circles. But we have Reverend McKnight develops Black unity and spiritual togetherness groups in 1990. We have Dr. Gail Porter develops primetime sister circles for African-American women in 2003. And then in concert, and this is where we get the expansion of probably the largest healing circle movement. In 2011, the Association of Black Psychologists develops the emotional emancipation circles for the Community Healing Network. And then finally, in 2020, we get, again, an explosion. I have here the Sawubona Healing Circle. That's what I'll be focusing on. I was a part of the construction of that. We also have the growth of the Ubuntu circles, Being Sacred Space. You have Safe Black Space out in Sacramento. You have the South LA circles, all based in this African-centered psychology. So let's get into the creation specifically of the Sawubona Healing Circles. So we can all recall, right, 2020 saw the disproportionate Black illness and mortality as it pertained to, deaths in COVID-19. And I was still completing my training around that time. I was based in New York. And at the time I was on the New York State's crisis hotline. Right? And it was like being in a war zone, right? The number of people who were calling, who had just people dying left and right. People left people like shook, right? And so the Black Family Summit, which is a coalition of Black professional organizations, reached out to the Association of Black Psychologists to say, what we're saying is distinct, right? We're seeing a lot of Black care professionals, Black first responders who are on the front lines, right? Going into these places, removing corpses, providing services, and also engaging or losing people in their day-to-day lives. Many of the people who are being lost were, right, primary care physicians, first responders as well. So they said, can you develop something for our first responders to hold the specific nature of this racial trauma? And so under, at the time, President Theopia Jackson for the Association of Black Psychologists recruited Tania Lodge. Dr. Tania Lodge at that time had been, I don't remember if she's the director, but had worked at one of the few African-centered mental health institutions in the country, the Minority Behavioral Health Group. So she was appointed co-chair to help develop this intervention. At the time, I was the student circle chair for the Association of Black Psychologists. I had time, so they asked if I could co-chair that with her. And they're all a little bit older, so they need a little bit of help with the technology piece. So help with that. We had a wisdom keeper who was Maria Cambone, who was a former president of the Association of Black Psychologists, and Dana Collins, who was the president of the New York Association of Black Psychologists. And so because of this, with the nature, this was the team that was assembled to build this intervention. And so why Sawubona? Right, so Sawubona is a Zulu greeting, Isi Zulu greeting. Until you see me, I do not exist. It is as if when you see me, you bring me into existence. So among the Zulu people, right, seeing is an act of bringing people into oneness, right? It's more than just, saying hi to somebody. It's based in the very core philosophy that we exist in community. People often make the comparison, right? We have, right, the I think, therefore I am. Right? Whereas among the Ubuntu people, it's like, I exist because we are, right? Like you exist as a collective. You cannot know yourself, you cannot know your purpose, you cannot know your community without being seen by that community. And so, especially during the Association of Black Psychologists, in that moment, we had done a community needs survey. And a lot of the people, this was broad in 2020, but a lot of the people who were writing to us were saying, isolation was the largest thing. Right? I'm experiencing this massive loss. I'm experiencing illness. I'm experiencing sickness. I'm experiencing uncertainty, and I'm alone. So this idea of Sawubona, for us, it was deeper than just isolation. It was people were losing their humanity. They were experiencing this type of repression with nobody to recognize, to validate, to affirm. So Sawubona became more than just the tagline. It became the very philosophy that the Healing Circle intervention was based upon. And so in terms of how we built it out, right, we used a community-defined evidence approach, right? So as opposed to we might call it evidence-based interventions, we based our intervention on were they coming to it? How were they finding it? Were they engaged in the space, right? That was our evidence, right? Utility for the people that we're building it for. We offer culturally relevant theories to understand the behavior of individuals of African ancestry. And again, it was based in what we've talked about, right? The African-centered, Afrocentric philosophies. So we're going to go through briefly. I just want to make sure. I was saying I have to run out right after this, so I'm going to go through some of the assessments. I want to make sure we have some time for questions and discussion. But our pilot assessment looked at, right, our performance among the first 99 people to attend in the first year. Everybody self-identified as Black, and participants were pulled from the de-identified archive of post surveys maintained by the Association of Black Psychologists. So we asked our leaders, right, the people that we trained. In the first few months, we trained maybe like 60 or 70 leaders in the community. So we asked them, what were the themes that were discussed? What are people coming to the healing circles with? We asked people, what was the strategy that you used, right, in your healing circle space? And we asked, what were the responses and reactions to those strategies from the attendees? Here's a bit of an overview over how we did our thematic analysis. I don't want to spend too much time here. I want to dig into the results. So in terms of what themes people came to the healing circles with, it was racial battle fatigue, racial trauma. So the pain of watching a George Floyd was an example, right? The pain of watching disproportionate Black death, police killings, right? That's what they were coming to the healing circles, right, with. We had racial battle fatigue in addition, right? So you all remember 2020 was an election year. And so there was, as people were experiencing this isolation, there was uncertainty that the political mechanisms would allow them to feel kind of safe and secure. So we had somebody say, the stress from election day was offered. However, in our small group discussion, the theme was the heaviness of trying to meet the needs of Black community, the toll of racial trauma heightened during 2020, that reopened wounds, and the stress of trying to cope. We had broad discussions of systemic injustice. So the Chauvin trial, individual choices on self-care, anger and pain on experiencing the murder of George Floyd, a strong desire to see Chauvin and other officers convicted. We had broad political uncertainty. So what I want to note too, right, is as we look at this, we see a lot of people aren't coming for what we might term or classify. We might do that at a later stage, right? Depression, PTSD. We're talking about specific intersections, right? Where we expand how we understand our mental health, specific relationships between people and community, specific relationships between people and the political apparatus that they're engaged in, right? A lack of faith, right? Institutional betrayal. So this, by and large, what people are coming to these circles to receive aid for. And so here's the same quotes just to move through. The second piece, right, and this is what makes these circles, one of the most engaging things for me is we provided people a broad structure, right? We trained leaders, we taught them the history of African-centered psychology, but the core piece of this is we wanted people to bring whatever African or Afro-diasporic cultural background they had, right? The history that they were brought up in to co-construct the space. And so we had people who could do libations, right, in the traditional Zimbabwean way. Right? We had people who did prayers in Haitian Creole. We had people bring drum beats from Guinea, all used to co-form healing spaces for the dialogues that they had. And so broadly, we saw people introduce meditations. So a lot of people use meditations. We had people do guided breath work. We had affirmations. We had just the idea of Sawubona itself, explaining that concept, that idea to people. African proverbs. So we saw some people use proverbs, day names like they do use in Ghana, the virtues of Mayat, introduction of Sankofa. So introducing specific, right, African-based philosophies, terms, ideas to name the specific types of distress that people were experiencing, to name the specific relationships to history that they were in conflict with. We use libations. So again, in the idea of people being and existing in community, a lot of the healing circles began by inviting people not to just bring themselves, but their ancestors, right? People they've recently lost, heroes that they've had that they really look to in terms for political and cultural inspiration. We had the virtues of Mayat, some of the earliest, based in ancient Kemet, virtues that people use to guide, right, well-being. So a lot of people bringing these, I could say from hosting most, I would say like 90% of the first healing circles that the Association of Black Psychologists did. It was fascinating to see that, back to what we were saying, as long as people brought that warmth, the impact was still felt. So we had people who do guided meditations and breath work for 5-6 minutes and tell her, okay, close your eyes, do this. And I'm like, wow, this is great. Damn, this person not here today. Saw somebody do a single like a single affirmation, but it was the right affirmation. It took 2 seconds, but you could see the impact hit the exact same. So people brought in these distinct different parts of their own cultural identity to shape the space. And it was the act of being held, the act of being seen that people felt the sense of relief from. And so that's what we'll get into, right? How do people respond? Right? We saw themes of praise, gratitude, validation, engagement, and excitement. So I'm going to blow up these quotes a little bit with this theme of praise, right? The healing circle continues as long as possible. They're very much needed. Idea of healing. This was helpful and healing for me as a Black man in America who serves as a psychologist. My spirit needed this. Thank you. So I can say we put our post-circle survey. We asked people, in addition to their feedback, was it helpful and would they come again? And 100% of the people, I didn't even report the data because it's boring, 100% of the people said like yes to both those questions. And it's the type of intervention I've rarely been a part of something that was received so positively. And so since the initial pilot in 2020, the Sawubona Healing Circle specifically have been rolled out in response to several anti-Black racial traumas in the community. We've had the Black Lives Matter uprisings, the assassination of the Haitian president. We've used them for displaced African refugees at the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, various police killings, and as well as the 2022 Buffalo mass shooting and hate crime. So I want to pause here. These are the people who were taken. Do you all recall that there was a hate crime in a shopping mall, grocery store in Buffalo? And these are all the victims of that shooting. So shortly after that massacre, before the state or anybody reached out, a lot of these organizations went into action. That's what they do, right? So we had the Community Healing Network, the National Association of Black Social Workers, the Association of Black Psychologists, all began to offer virtual and in-person services to people who are reeling in the community from that event. We had the New York ABSI co-led in-person healing circles for Erie County Department of Social Services. In the week following, we were contacted by the White House Office of Community Partnerships, as well as the New York State Office of Mental Health, because the need was so severe. And so we partnered with them again to offer both training as well as these healing spaces in the 2 years since. So we agreed to host regular Sawubona healing circles with a focus on those impacted by the massacre in Buffalo for 2 years. We set out to train 200 local leaders in the model of virtual circle facilitation and offer continued support and technical assistance to local leaders over the next 2 years. I'm going to move past this just because, again, I want to get to the questions and piece, but this is over our first year. So the people who did fill out our surveys, right, we had an N of 602. The location, we opened this up broadly, and I was a bit intentional about that. There was discussion about whether we should limit this specifically to people in Buffalo, but as long as there was space for people, it's virtual, we allowed other people, whoever needed it, to come. So 51% of the attendees reported partial or full residence in New York. The other 49% were from around the world. We had 99% of people identifying as Black and or as somebody of African descent. Our ethnic background, 52.5% identifies as African American, with 24.7% Caribbean American. And interestingly, 80% of people who use the circles were Black women. And I want to note, right, when it comes to, again, the diversity of people calling in from, broadly, it was the United States, but we had a lot of people from Canada, the United Kingdom. We had people calling in from the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Brazil. A lot of people from, I think, Nigeria, Ghana, as well as what's the other place? Those were the main spots. And what I want to ask really quickly, so one of the things we assessed, just to get an understanding of how people, again, wanted to cope with the racial trauma they experienced. What do y'all think is the most popular coping mechanism among Black people? Y'all have to guess. See, no, you can't do that again because you won't do it. I knew it, but you guys look at her and say, like, I told you.
So sure, talk to somebody else.
Talking to somebody else is a great one. I like that. Say again? Music is a solid one. I like that. Okay.
Church.
Church. It's great. Okay. So the most popular coping mechanism we saw was helping other people. One of the things that was fascinating to me when we opened it up, right? So we opened up this initiative with the New York Office of Mental Health. We had two options, right? You could train to become a circle leader to give circles to your community. You could receive the circles yourself. There was nearly 10 times as much interest among community members to be able to learn how to do the healing circles so they could help people in their community, right? It's a type of active coping. It gave people a sense of agency after they felt like their dignity had been taken. So again, I thought this was fascinating. 52.2% endorsed. The way I cope with stress is reaching out and helping somebody else. And then you all nailed the other ones, right? We have sharing feelings with friends or family members. People use, again, another collective coping mechanism. Thought of all the struggles Black people have had to endure, which gave you strength, hope things would get better with time, and sought emotional support from friends and family. So you can see right here, we have collective is the strongest coping mechanism, and then right after is the spiritual type of coping. And so we asked people, right, what was on their heart and mind going into these healing circle spaces. I got a little artsy with this, did a little word map, and these were the broad themes, the broad energy people were moving into the spaces with. So grief, tired, emotional. We have another person who was killed by the police, Tyree Nichols, up there. Violence, Black trauma, racism. So this is the energy people moved into the healing circle with. So we see these broad themes, right? A desire to heal from racial trauma and racial-related stress. So recognizing ongoing freedom from Eurocentrism, how to heal a legacy of harm against Black people and among us by looking inward as a first step. A desire to be in collective, a desire to be in community. So connecting with other like minds, a space to be with folks like me as we come together to heal and transform. A desire to process community violence. So I've purposely kept myself from excessive news about this event, but do want to take space to process it with others and understand. And a desire specifically for African-centered support. So I live and work in a community that's been greatly impacted by racialized trauma. I want to learn how to guide members of my community in healing practices that affirm the richness of Black culture and identity. So that's what they moved into the healing circle spaces with. This is what they came out with. This is my favorite thing. Just yes. Yes. Right? Breathing, reminded, importance, meditation. So again, the broad ideas we see people leave the healing circles with, ideas of gratitude. The circle was so powerful. I love the fact that we can come together and talk about issues. I felt the connection of our hearts and minds, of our minds and hearts. The heart chakra was open. Desire for more circles. I hope these get support to grow because it's lacking in most communities. Community, I'm grateful to have been guided here, and I'm excited to implement what I'm learning into my own healing practices and to share them with my family and community. And a desire to lead. I'm grateful to have been guided here, and I'm excited to implement what I'm learning into my own healing practices and to share them with my family and community. So I move through is where we see this going. So in terms of straight data and research, we're currently partnered with the REAL Lab that's based at Yale School of Medicine. We're doing longitudinal analyses as well as thematic and narrative analyses of all attendees and leaders to get a more deep, thorough understanding of how people experience this, how it helps them heal from categories of like racialized trauma, the traditional categories of depression, PTSD, to see if we can evidence at that level of support. And I received a grant a few months ago through the Restorative Justice Commission to train community leaders in Massachusetts. So we just trained about 12 people so that we can roll the healing circles out, specifically based in Massachusetts. And it's not just the Sawubona healing circles, right? So I focused on this specific paradigm, this specific model, but these are taken up all over the place. So we have the Ubuntu healing circles through the Community Healing Network, the Safe Black Space healing circles, the South LA healing circles, the IO resistance circles by the Ubuntu Party, Beam Heart Space healing circles, Black Unity and Spiritual Togetherness, and so much more, right? This has really taken off as a movement. Because again, we have a lot of people who are noting we are not getting our mental health, our specific mental health needs met. So currently I'm leading a working group based on some of the leaders of these various healing circle movements to identify best practices and guidelines for African-centered healing circles. As a group, we've identified several. These are still working. People have a lot of different ideas and debate. We've noted that they should be grounded in African values, designed exclusively for people who have had the unique lived experience of being Black in an anti-Black world. Grassroots and offer opportunities for collective work and community building. This is essential because we do see a lot of people who try to co-opt this and make people pay for the service when the very nature of them is supposed to be a community-based model. Right, so we receive grant funding to support the work, but the idea is not to charge people for the service. That they focus on storytelling, and we share the skills again to promote emotional wellness. So this is a model that people can come to, can learn to engage in, and learn to spread themselves. I'm going to close with a quote from one of my favorite psychologists in the Association of Black Psychologists. We say, "Jegna instead of mentor," and she's been transformational for me. This is Linda James Myers. She says, "The way the African-centered system is structured, we are one with the source of all things good. The extent to which we entertain the dominant Eurocentric conceptual system, at best, aspects of that truth will be fragmented in our experience. The choice of conceptual system is ours. Power is the ability to define reality." Thank you. So
Thank you for the awesome talk. I think if you're okay with it, I don't know if there are questions in the Q&A online. I think it might be nice to start there since folks here might have an additional minute or two with you after the end of the webinar, in case we have
so
questions.
I got this. Yeah, can you
Pick off one or two and then we'll go to the room. Okay.
Can universities bring these circles into their mental health care offerings? Yes. So the Association of Black Psychologists right now, I'm leading a restructuring of the Healing Circle program. But one of the pieces that we do, get this guy right here. One of the things that we do is we enter into partnerships with universities, with organizations, with hospital-based settings to grow the Healing Circle. So to train people in that setting and to provide them, again, free of charge for people who are in those settings. Okay.
Should we go to the room then? If there.
Oh yeah, that was the.
So in the room, are there any questions? Comments, thoughts?
I also got one more. So while y'all thinking.
Okay.
You mentioned that drums were brought into some healing circles. How much did music play a part in them? For instance, choral music can be used for a positive affirmation. Yeah, so a good number of the healing circles, we always started with music. So you had different generations of people use different musics to ground them. So when we did the healing circles, we did them for Haitian victims of kidnapping. And so we began with traditional compa music, right, to set the mood, set the tone, set a joyous theme for the space. If I've led a healing circle with people who tend to be a little bit closer to my generation, I might start with a Joey Badass at the beginning. You know, other people who go with, all my friends are going to, who's the something in the rock, sweet something in the rock? Sweet Honey in the Rock. Yeah, yeah. We got a lot of other people who love that to begin the circles. So yeah, music has been an essential piece of them. How does one connect with those recently trained in Massachusetts? So we should put more information. I'll share those links and stuff with you. So
that'd be awesome. Yeah, we can try and circulate it to folks.
Okay, beautiful. And
did you find anything about why there's such a high prevalence of Black women attending the circles? Does it have to do with the disproportionate burden of mental health issues on women or like the stigma surrounding mental health in men, or I don't know, do you find anything like that?
Yeah, so everything is going to be me speculating, right? So we haven't specifically done any qualitative pieces around that. I do, if I had to guess, I do think it has to do with like the profession itself, right? So if I gave a circle, I would have a few more red men come into those circles. Right now, I gave you the stats for 4% of the mental health workforce is Black. Like 3.5% of that is Black women, right? So there's very few Black men in those spaces who are spreading that. So I do think there's this gendered component to who's leading and then thus who the services are seen as being for. And even then, I've seen people use the spaces in distinct ways, right? What vulnerability looks like through a gendered lens looks distinct. So we are trying to, I was intentional when I started training the people out here to make sure we were getting Black men from different, not just political worldviews, but different understandings of healing. Like we have people who do self-defense, for instance, that we tend not to see when we recruit from the Association of Black Psychologists, but when we're talking to the community, it's an essential part of healing and protection. So I think it's like who we've trained and as a result, who the space is seen as being for. But it's speculation on my part.
I have a question if there, unless we have any in the, so I really like that quote that was from a psychologist. And the reason is I'm trying to reconcile this really amazing work with, say, in the biomedical context, like what's taught in medical schools, or I imagine what's taught in psychology, right, as sort of mainstream psychology, right, which is largely individual, now probably right now dominated by cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT based strategies, which are largely individual, which work, and oftentimes as effective as medications, or sometimes almost as effective as medications, or add value to medications. How do you, I mean, as someone who's trained in, I imagine, some of those approaches, right? Or I'm thinking about the person who was a psychologist who's probably also trained in those approaches, right? CBT, these kinds of standard approaches, which are really the dominant approaches in psychological counseling. How do you think about this from that perspective?
Yeah, I think about it in two ways, right? So there's part of me, especially as I was coming out of my training, where I was thinking about it through that lens. Like, okay, what do I actually think is the mechanism here? I don't know if it's like when they do the libations, like the ancestors actually come in, like what do I actually think is the mechanism here? But when I think take a step back and look at the broad discourse around mental health that's going on in distinct communities, I see these as targeting almost what a lot of CBT doesn't seek to address, that we can't necessarily name in a DSM. Right? So if I get somebody coming to me saying, I want to heal from like intergenerational trauma, I want to heal because I feel like my ancestor was harmed and that's continuing with me today. We, in a CBT model, or psychodynamic model, we can reinterpret that, but we can't speak to you specifically on your idiom of distress. We can't speak to you exactly with how you're understanding and examining what's going on for you. And so we see that a lot in these healing circle spaces where people will speak to spirit wounds, right? People will speak to ancestral legacies. CBT, again, can reinterpret those things and meet them on a particular level. The healing circles are spaces where people can, again, go directly to those things that I don't think a lot of traditional therapies seek to address.
Or they don't have the language for it.
You don't have the language for it, right? I think Dr. Tama, she's the president of the American Psychological Association now, said that we have a model of mental health that in very many ways is fairly understandably like agnostic on a lot of like spiritual, religious properties, but we're treating a population that is largely religious, largely spiritual. So when people say like there are these like spiritual wounds, in some ways you're doing a disservice to reinterpret that to like, oh, that means like maybe the super ego isn't fully connected in this type of way, or right, you're doing it, you're not, to use the Sawubona, you're not fully seeing right what somebody's experiencing. So feel like it's that what you were saying.
And I have a follow-up and then I'll turn it over.
Yeah, of course.
to just a really quick one, which is sort of building on that question then, thinking about the limits of these circles in terms of like what they do address, which is like, for example, collective racial trauma, right? Take after Buffalo, right, which I imagine has huge repercussions within, you know, the Black community, right?
Yeah.
Psychologically. Two, like, are there things that sort of at an individual level, which is what a lot of psychotherapy, you know, tries to do and fails because we don't have enough providers and,
Yeah.
you know, may not speak the right idiom. You know, what are the limits, do you think, of sort of what the circles can do
Yeah.
for, say, specific types of things which may be outside of collective trauma, for example?
Yeah, so there's so many things, right? Like first and foremost, and there's a lot of people who've been worried about this. We haven't had this specific issue yet, but there are multiple ways that people experience distress, right? Some people might have experiences that lead to what we call like a psychosis, right? And the Healing Circle collective space is not really a space where people can contain, right, that experience of distress. There's when people have particular high levels of suicide. So I would say like high levels of crisis, right, kind of interrupt the space, right? I think there are aspects of, we dealt with this when we were working in Haiti, right, where people were talking about their experiences being kidnapped. Well, we can set the foundations, right, of saying, here's what the safe space is. People are still in that community, right? And so what they share in collective space is still like, when we're doing the work out here, right, might be a bit more safe when you're doing that work out there. This could be a little bit, it could be a lot more dangerous.
Yes.
Right. So I would say those are some of the limits that we've been seeing and thinking about how could we can like transform how we do some of this collective work.
So there's a question, sorry, there are two questions and then we'll have to, I think, close. So, you have a question then behind?
Yeah, so I just had a follow-up on the first question. So I feel like the difference between like CBT psychodynamic versus these healing circles is that the healing circle is very oriented. And there are other, like, I guess, Western therapy modalities like DBT, for example, where it is in a group setting such that, you know, it's very structured in that way. I assume if you compare like DBT to these healing circles, or I guess my question would be like, for these healing circles, is it structured in a way? Is it perhaps like, are there difficulties and barriers because it is more of a group setting than on the converse with like other, I guess, like things you can do because it's a group setting that you wouldn't be able to do individually?
Yeah, so there's a few different things, right? One, I'm like listing
Yeah, there were a lot of questions.
Yeah. So first and foremost, right, is you're building with people, right, in community, right? And compared to a DBT, it is meant to be a bit less structured, right? Within DBT, right, you have, I am the psychologist, I am the therapist, I am the clinician. Right? Within the circle-based setting, you still have somebody who's leading the space, but the leader is a part of the healing space, right? And so there's meant to be a bit less of a hierarchy in that regard. And so you have people pulling from everybody, right? In terms of what healing can I get? I moved into a healing circle and been like, what healing can I get from this space? Because here's like, there's less of that like removal, that professional removal from the space. And because of that, you get also a lot of like community political building, right? One of the previews of some of the narrative thematic analysis we did is a lot of people left the healing circles with kind of new community political commitments, right? To building systems, building infrastructure, specifically to address Black racial trauma. And a lot of that planning, that education happens in the circle space because it's not seen as like separate, right? It's seen as people are having these relationships to these systems. And so that's why I kind of lean into like the flexible nature of it, right? I'm not necessarily going to the healing circle specifically to address like my relationship with another individual, right? We're not working on relational skills today. And today isn't like mindfulness day, right? Today isn't how we separate emotions from feelings day, right? It's what are the people coming to, and they shape the space, which is why I say almost every single healing circle I've been to, it looks distinct. Right? I say it like with a lot of certainty. Yeah. You can ask another thing, but ask again and I'll come back in.
If we could just take a last question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. as I was listening, I was thinking, is it possible to have a continuum of these? So the ones you shared were seem to be more reactive to events and have proactive ones, like feel.
Yeah.
And are there alternatives that could be longitudinal? So perhaps a group meets because of some trauma that's happened in the community. And then continues over time, which is both proactive and reactive. So
The answer is yes, right? So I said at the beginning, we were getting some support from SAMHSA. So the circles that were being done through them were exactly that. Like they were hosted every Monday and Thursday for the last 2 years. And so you had a lot of people who went continuously. And some of the longitudinal data from them, it's transformational, right? It's like incredible to see like those stories. Because of bandwidth, honestly, the Sawubona Healing Circles is almost like shifted from like sometimes being crisis response, sometimes being more longitudinal, like day by day, sometimes being completely based on like training. I would say right now we've been shifted more towards the focus on training. But the restructuring that I was talking about is meant to expand the committee such that we can address all these needs. So here's our every day. You come to this space every day, you build with these people. And we're going to have the crisis response, right? And we're going to have people who are focused more on like the international piece, and we're doing research partnerships. So it's meant to expand each of those arms. So that's what we're at right now. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So we went a couple of minutes over, but thank you also to everyone online who joined. And we will we'll be circulating the February seminar information soon. And thanks again for coming.